We're in the middle of a series presenting the Eightfold Path, a team of teachers. Each week we're taking a different element in the Eightfold Path, plus a beginning and a wrap-up, so it's 10 weeks altogether. And tonight I am Susan Stone, and I am taking part in this series. And I wanted to start out by saying that the Buddha taught from the ground up. That is, a great part of his teaching was right where we lived. He had to make a conscious decision, and he did this at the very beginning. There's a story in the scriptures that after Siddhartha Gautama woke up, he was 36 years old at the time, and he became a Buddha, a supremely enlightened being. And at first, he didn't want to teach. He said that what he knew was too subtle, and it was too hard to convey the whole picture. Too many people would understand, and actually he felt it would be tiresome for him to try to convey it. Now the scriptures say that a god, Brahma, came to him and convinced him that he should teach out of compassion and for the good of the many. And I think we can understand this as his own inner debate about it. But obviously, he was convinced, and he did. He agreed and decided that he would teach. But the truth is, he didn't get it right at first. And we know this from another story told in the scriptures, in which the Buddha, shortly after his awakening, went to find 5 of his, I guess you'd say, co-meditators when he was younger and searching. And he came upon another man altogether before he found the 5, a man from a sect called Ajivaka. He met this Ajivaka, and the story of this meeting is often told by teachers nowadays. The man looked at him, and I'm talking about the Ajivaka, looked at the Buddha, and he saw there was someone really special here. And he said, "Who are you?" And basically he went through a few different options, and the Buddha kept saying, "No. Are you a prince?" And the Buddha said, "No, he wasn't." And finally he said, "Well, who are you?" And in essence, and I'm not quoting exactly, the Buddha said, "I am awake." And usually when teachers tell this story, that's more or less the end of it, because the point is, just as he woke up, the whole point of his teaching is, so can we. And it's an inspiring story, but the truth is, that's not the end of it. The scripture says that there was more. The Buddha didn't only say, "I am awake." He went on and expressed in terms of, "I am the solely awakened, self-awakened one, and I am supremely awakened." And he went on in that vein for a little bit. And the Ajivaka looked at him, and according to the scripture, he said, "Well, good for you, friend." And he shook his head, and he walked off in the other direction. So clearly the point of this story, I think as we can see it, is that manner of teaching was a flop. And the Buddha realized it. He's not going to convince anyone. He's not going to teach anyone that way. And I guess we could ask, how might we react under those circumstances if someone came up to us and told us, "Oh, I am supremely awakened, I am solely self-awakened." The upshot was that the Buddha shifted his presentation thereafter. And by the way, this interpretation that I've just told you of this meeting with the Ajivaka is an interpretation that I initially came across through Ajahn Amaro, and I think it really makes a lot of sense. So what happened after that was that the Buddha still, of course, talked about liberation. He talked about deliverance. He called it unshakable deliverance of mind. He talked about nirvana, what we might think of as the top of the mountain, top of the spiritual mountain. And the whole point was each one of us can get there. But mainly he talked, depending on the audience, he shifted his approach to what we can call a graduated approach. He spoke from the place that people could readily relate to in terms of their daily experience. Now always, his point was, well, he said one point, we might think of it as 2. He taught about suffering and the end of suffering. Or we might phrase it and look at it from a slightly different point of view, and you could say he taught from how to live now, right now, wherever you are in your life, with less suffering, with greater ease, with inner ease and joy. And second of all, you could say that he taught about how to move on, that the teaching is onward leading, how to move on to the place of deliverance of mind, and saying you can do it. And I think it's important to remember these two different perspectives as we practice, because otherwise it is so easy to get kind of swamped and discouraged in our own practice and think, oh, my mind is running on, I'm never going to get it, I've got so far to go. So just remembering, it isn't just about getting stuck and never breaking out. There's something altogether different, and it isn't a matter of just making one step after another. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Let's come back to right now. His basic teaching, ground up. Basically, the Buddha spoke about four noble truths, which many of you know. There is suffering in life, that the cause of suffering is grasping, clinging, that the transcending of suffering lies in letting go, and that there are 8 factors that can be practiced in order to help us train ourselves to let go. The Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, as truth number 4 is called, have been identified as the elephant's footprint. The footprint in which much of his teaching, certainly his teaching on this everyday level, is encompassed. So, the Eightfold Path. Now, the 8 factors are, and we're talking about them one a week, is wise view, wise intention, wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, wise energy, mindfulness, and concentration. And I think it's interesting to note that the Buddha starts with suffering. And it's a good place to start if we take a look at it, because suffering's a great galvanizer. You know, if he started with, oh boy, we can all be so happy, we might be like happy dogs sleeping in the sun and might never be kind of galvanized. So suffering, this is what we're focusing on. And our team of teachers has already introduced this. Last time, Hugh Burns talked about wise action, and that is bringing the teaching, the Dharma, into all aspects of your life. Now, Hugh spoke particularly about habits, patterns of thoughts and behaviors that can drive us when they're not examined. But of course, wise action does include habits and exploring unexamined habits. It also includes every other aspect of our life as well. So tonight, I'm going to be talking about wise speech. And I'm going to be speaking not only about wise speech, but because every one of these factors is linked with every other, I'm going to, in particular, focus on a couple of them. Obviously, mindfulness is part of wise speech, inextricably linked. And also loving-kindness. I want to talk about that as well. And finally, toward the end, I'd like to discuss wise speech in the context of social conditions. So things to remember about, going back to our beginning here, about the Eightfold Path, about wise speech. Each one of these factors are not simply to be memorized. They're not to just let them flow in one ear and out of the other. They are, in fact, practices. It's fluid, the Eightfold Path, as is all of the Buddha's teaching. The Buddha taught for 45 years, a huge amount of material. In terms of written pages, it's thousands of pages. But in the Buddha's day, of course, the tradition, the culture was oral. There was no writing. And monks memorized the teachings, repeated the teachings. It was an oral culture. And in order to do that, there are certain phrases and teachings that have been standardized to facilitate memorization. So what we come up with is lots of lists, 4s of this and 8s of that and 5 of the other things. So it's really easy when we are first listening and learning about the Dharma, the teaching, to think that it sounds pretty static. But in fact, the Buddha wasn't trying to present a neat system. He was trying to describe reality. And reality is fluid. And practice needs to be cultivated continually. Moreover, the Eightfold Path, the factors, in fact, all of his teaching is interrelated. You could say it's holographic. With regard to wise speech in particular, I should say that it has a special meaning for me, wise speech as a factor in the Eightfold Path. Some years ago, I was at a retreat, and I was listening to a talk on one of the scriptures in the middle-length discourses. It's talk number 38. And in it, the Buddha blasted a monk named Sati for his misunderstanding of an aspect of the Dharma. And he did this in front of other bhikkhus, other monks. He berated Sati and he called him a misguided man. And he said he misrepresented the teachings and he injured himself and he stored up much demerit. And he went on in that vein. And I thought, as I listened to the teacher speaking and reread the sutta, the scripture later, I thought, oh, poor Sati. The scripture says he sat silent, dismayed, with shoulders drooping and head down, glum and without response. And even worse than that, in addressing Sati in the scripture, he repeatedly called him son of a fisherman. Now, fishermen in those days were outcasts. And in fact, although they're no longer outcasts legally, in India, they still are in effect. But in effect, by repeatedly calling him and identifying Sati, it's not only that he misunderstood the Dharma, but here he was, the son of an outcast, and it was like a double hit, and it struck me at the time as bigotry. And so I heard and listened to this talk, completely overlooking at this point the teacher's main point, which actually wasn't on Sati at all, but was about the Dharma point. But I was incensed. It seemed to me mean-spirited. It seemed to me lacking in compassion, and certainly didn't seem to be wise speech. And so the thought that went through my mind was, oh no, somebody really needs to write something about this, to protest. And to make a long story short, because I didn't want to do it, I thought somebody else should do it. But eventually, to make a long story short, I ended up writing a novel about it, with Sati as the key character. In fact, the novel has turned into a trilogy, 3 novels, of which one is already published, the second is about to be published, and the third, well, sometime in the next maybe a year or two. The first, by the way, the Kosambi Intrigue. So, guidelines for wise speech. Wise speech has to do with personal integrity. It's one of those factors that fits into that, I guess you'd say, category of the Eightfold Path. You know, a person who's sloppy in their speech really doesn't honor his or her own integrity. Saying if they say what they do in order to please others or for any other reason other than authenticity and honesty and kindness, well, this isn't an approach that's filled with integrity. Now, the Buddha, when he talked about wise speech, he did so and had different formulations, which isn't surprising. As I said, he taught for 45 years, and he didn't have a piece of paper to read from, so it was a little bit different. In terms of, he spoke in both positive and negative terms about wise speech. And in positive terms, the formulation that I like best, and I'll say he's had different factors within it, but he said in this one that wise speech is speech that's spoken at the proper time. It's true, it's beneficial, it's spoken gently, and with a mind of loving kindness. So again, proper time, true, beneficial, spoken gently, and with a mind of loving kindness. In negative terms, unwise speech, he said, is speech that is false speech, malicious speech, harsh speech, and useless speech. Now, as you can see from all this, wise speech doesn't have just one factor. It's complicated. No one-sided answer as to what was wise speech. And what the Buddha is talking about and offering are guidelines, not a set of hard and fast rules. These are guidelines. And they're situational. Every single situation involving speech has to be judged on its own merits. So an individual practitioner really has to discern moment by moment what constitutes here, in this moment, what is wise speech. And I can say that means that our training in the Dharma overall is important. It's not just wise speech. Overall training, as we mature in the training and increase in sensitivity and clarity, compassion, as we grow towards spiritual maturity, all of these things work together and enable us to discern in time, or have clear discernment in time, what is wise speech in specific situations. Now, when we think of wise speech, true speech is really important, obviously. The Buddha once said that the tongue is an axe in the mouth. The tongue can be brutal, with little regard for truth, just kind of hacking away. I think that for most of us, or perhaps maybe for just about anyone who is listening to this talk, maybe we don't use the tongue as an axe. But I do think there are many times when we use it as a razor. And razors can be even more painful than axes because they're more refined, more subtle. You might miss an axe, but a razor, you couldn't dismiss an axe, but a razor, what is using the tongue as a razor? Well, it could be an untrue statement that is cloaked as a fact. It could be said absolutely in a calm way and with seeming conviction, and it might be absolutely untrue. Or sarcasm, or a hurtful joke, or exaggeration, namely saying something that's true but emphasizing it more than it need to be. So I think each of us needs to think about, when do we use the tongue as a razor? And maybe a joke that is a little bit hurtful to somebody. Or we make a sarcastic remark. And once again, maybe the comment is absolutely true factually, but perhaps the tone in which we say it conveys something else. Also, the Buddha spoke about gentle speech and beneficial speech. There's a very interesting scripture in the Middle Length Discourses, it's number 58, in which a layperson, he was a prince, asked the Buddha, he said, about gentle speech and beneficial speech, and he pointed out that the Buddha had really sharply disciplined one of his disciples, a cousin, who was trying to undermine and split the Sangha, the monastic community. And the Buddha said all kinds of things to him, including calling him a lick-spittle. Now, actually, when I first read that, I never heard that word lick-spittle, but it left no question in my mind that it wasn't a good thing to be a lick-spittle. And so this prince asked the Buddha, certainly, was this wise speech? Certainly his cousin who heard it, couldn't have considered it gentle, maybe not even beneficial. And it's very, very interesting. The Buddha, and the Buddha came back, not right away, there was a second meeting here, but the Buddha basically came back and he said, wise speech doesn't consist of only one factor, just as we've been saying. He said there are many. And basically, as we think about this, we need to recognize that, no, his speech was not gentle on that occasion, but certainly he felt it was necessary and beneficial, not only, hopefully, for the cousin who was trying to do evil, who was so ill-intentioned with regard to the Sangha, but also maybe for the Sangha as a whole, to keep it united. And I might also say, with regard to the monk that I initially spoke about, Sati, I think the same considerations were true. Sati wasn't trying to divide the Sangha, but he certainly wasn't representing the teaching properly. And according to that scripture, he eventually did learn, and that the Buddha's rebuke helped him learn what was actually what the Dharma was about. When we consider what beneficial that element as part of wise speech, intention is important. The Buddha said, speak only what promotes skillful mental qualities, not what promotes unskillful ones. In other words, when we speak, he's advising people to promote clarity and kindness and confidence, not anything that would promote greed or aversion or confusion. And intention is critical. And also proper time. So many complexities are involved when we speak. And what might be a right time in one moment to say something might in the next moment or the next day or the next week be absolutely the wrong time. It may be true, but no longer appropriate. Maybe no longer well-intended. So we need to be really careful. For example, if we're in a group discussion and there's a certain point, a topic is being discussed, and we've got what we think is a great point to make, but the conversation moves on before we have a chance to make it, then we're facing the question, should I say it anyway, even though we've moved on to another topic or another aspect of this topic? Or shall I let it go? And then we're faced, how much of this deliberation is our own sense that we want to be heard? So it gets into being wise intention right there. Wise intention, as I said, is also framed in the negative. So there are 4 kinds of harmful speech. The false speech, the lies, are words spoken with an intent of misrepresenting the truth. Malicious or divisive speech, words that intend to create rifts between people. Harsh speech, words to hurt another person's feeling. They're not gentle. There's no kindness in them. And idle chatter, or useless speech, as it's sometimes translated. Like gossip. And we could say, talking behind others' backs, or just talking with absolutely no purpose at all except to fill in the time. So we need to really ask ourselves, what is my intent here as I speak? And if it's just gossip and it's filling in the time, or talking about someone else behind someone's back, I think we can ask ourselves, what do we get out of it? Sometimes some people can get some kind of pleasure in saying things behind others' backs. So we need to ask ourselves, what about me? Why am I doing it? Gossiping behind someone's back. No, it's not helpful. And another aspect of idle chatter, the Buddha was really clear when talking to his monks. He said nothing should be spoken about except the Dharma. Now, obviously, he couldn't give those same guidelines to lay people. Got all kinds of things lay people have got to think about that we need to think about this day. So we have to be, in a way, more discerning. The bar is higher for us. We need to talk about schooling or education or the grocery store or the computer, whatever else we're talking about. Where is it necessary, and where does wise speech leave off? That's an ongoing challenge for every one of us. Now, I think that practicing with wise speech is a process. There are guidelines that invite you to see for yourself. It's a practice. And I think there are 2 phases in this practice of wise speech. And the first, and in fact, I would say all the other 8 factors in the Eightfold Path are perhaps divided into these 2 phases as well. The first is the phase of a kind of provisional acceptance, like, okay, we're just new to the teachings, and we think, okay, I'll try it out. So provisionally. But if after enough practice you begin to see for yourself why this is really, really important, then you begin to internalize the guidelines. You begin to develop, with regard to wise speech, and I'm focusing now on wise speech, you begin to develop a gut feeling as to when you are speaking wisely and when you're not. You don't have to just run through the Buddha's list of characteristics of wise speech and unwise speech. I call this, and when you're not, I call it the yuck factor. The yuck factor comes into play when we use wise speech. We know it when we have said something that is unwise, and it just doesn't feel good. There's a contraction in the body, energetically. We might know it intellectually, but you don't have to think about it very much intellectually. You just know it. You feel yucky. And I think the other factor that comes into play is the factor. When you do use wise speech, mindful speech, kind speech, you know when you have spoken openly and skillfully and honestly. There's a sense of equanimity. At the same time, I think unwise speech, we're warned against it, but the truth is, it can be a gift, a prod to our learning process. It's not just a great big no-no. Don't ever do it. Nothing maybe in the Buddha's. Well, let us not go there. But at any rate, it's not just a big no-no. It's a useful signal. It's a signal when we find ourselves falling into unwise speech to look, to investigate. Think, what triggered that? Why did I say that? We investigate not to blame ourselves, but to know ourselves. This is part of the power of this practice. Investigating our intent. And when we do investigate, when we honestly look and are aware of what is going on with us when we have slipped into unwise speech, then unwise speech and the yuck factor can become a gift. It's part of our path of transformation, working with our hindrances and obscurations. Now, we all know that thoughts arise. Estimates are that somewhere, I don't know who got this or how, but somewhere between 50 to 70,000 thoughts a day arise in the average mind. And the truth is, we can't control this. This is what the mind does. The mind thinks. And it thinks according to how it has been conditioned. So we can't control all of what arises. But we do have a choice about whether and how to express what arises in the mind. And then the Buddha said, and spoke about wise speech, he said it's important to speak with loving kindness. Here's where the heart qualities come in. Loving kindness, a tender regard for all. Compassion, a tender regard for all who are suffering, and that includes ourselves. Personally, I think that it is too bad that the Buddha didn't mention loving kindness as a factor in the Eightfold Path. In fact, I think it should have been the Ninefold Path. He certainly spoke about it in detail, at length, and he spoke about it more than he did some of the other factors in the Eightfold Path. But be that as it may, no problem. It's there, it's important, and it's integral to wise speech. Part of wise speech, of course, part of this about the thoughts coming up, of course, is that some of the 50 to 70,000 thoughts that arise in a day slip into our speech sometime or another, and they may be unwise. the yuck factor coming up big time. We need to realize there's no perfection. And when we do slip into unwise speech, to have compassion, self-compassion for ourselves, not to blame ourselves, to recognize, to set an intention not to do it again, and to know we probably will, but it's not what we intend. And just as we have and are called on to have compassion for ourselves when we slip, so too I think we need to have compassion for others when they do likewise, when they're not speaking wisely. Really being mindful, trying to keep our heart and mind open, empathetic, bringing compassion to them, and equally not falling into automatically replying in a like manner. For example, if they've spoken in a harsh way or shot out an angry comment, we're called on not to respond in a like manner, to employ wise speech. And wise speech, of course, involves wise listening, deep listening, open listening. We can't really communicate until we listen to another with love, and I'm using it in this universal term, and empathy, not with resistance. And we don't even have to agree or like what the other person is saying to keep open. And to recognize, of course, if they are speaking unwisely, maybe harshly or whatever, just to listen and to hear. Bringing wise speech. Thich Nhat Hanh, in his book, For a Future to be Possible, summarizes the immense commitment that wise speech involves. He called it and said, aware of the suffering caused by unmindful speech and the inability to listen to others. I am committed to cultivating loving speech and deep listening in order to bring joy and happiness to others and relieve others of their suffering. Knowing that words can create happiness or suffering, I am determined to speak truthfully with words that can inspire self-confidence, joy, and hope. I will not spread news that I do not know to be certain, and will not criticize or condemn things of which I'm not sure. I will refrain from uttering words that can cause division or discord, or that can cause the family or community to break. I am determined to make all efforts to reconcile and resolve all conflicts, however small. Well, I think you can hear this is truly huge. And Thich Nhat Hanh was speaking from his own commitment. When in Vietnam, the country of his birth, in the last part of the 20th century, the last half of the 20th century, during the Vietnam War, he organized monks and lay volunteers to go into villages ravaged by war and to help the people there. It's a pretty universal commitment. And maybe not every one of us is ready to make such a huge commitment to reconcile and resolve all conflicts, however small. That may not be our role, but to hear it and know it's a possibility, and to recognize the immensity of what wise speech involves, and to commit to trying to use it in our own lives. Now, as I was developing this talk and thinking about wise speech, I was struck time and again by gratitude. I was so grateful. I recognized what immense good fortune I had to be free to practice wise speech. I began to think of some of the social conditions in which people, individuals and groups of people, historically and today as well, haven't been in a place where they could use wise speech, true, beneficial, proper time, loving kindness. Not everybody has been in the place where it would be wise to use wise speech. I was thinking in particular of women who across time and cultures have lived under patriarchy and have been expected, not all women, of course, and today, certainly in our culture, less and less are women expected to express in accommodating terms. But surely across time that has been the case. And I don't want to talk any more about that, but whole talks could be devoted to women and patriarchy and the implications for wise speech and how it limits wise speech. I do want to talk a little bit more about Black Americans in this country, because for American blacks, conditions have been far more dangerous. We all know before the Civil War in this country, in the mid-19th century, that strong language, if a black used strong language to the wrong person, namely a white person, and especially a white woman, they could get themselves killed. Things actually didn't change all that much after slavery. After the Emancipation Proclamation, a whole new system began to develop in the South that wasn't officially slavery, but by which blacks were imprisoned on practically no charge at all, and sometimes absolutely no charge at all, and sent from there into forced labor camps. Like, we could call it a camp. It was an industry. They were industries like lumber, mining, whatever. And they were used by the owners and their subordinates until many of them died by the thousands. It was inhumane treatment, and they were simply discarded. Other parts of the country turned their back. And I will just say there is a truly chilling and deeply factual book by a man named Douglas Blackman called Slavery by Another Name that outlines exactly what the situation was after the Civil War and before World War II. There was very little chance that even had someone, a black person, considered using wise speech, that it could have been absolutely inappropriate. It could have gotten them killed. And today, again, it's not the same. Nonetheless, 2 times, as we know, 2 times as many blacks as whites are unemployed, and 6 times as many are incarcerated. There's one story, and it is related in the comment related in the summer 2016 issue of Buddha Dharma, in which a black mother said about raising her son. She said, "I want to give my son fear. I want him to be afraid, because I'm scared to death he's going to either get arrested or get killed every time he leaves the house." Where is wise speech there? That has got to be speech that is severely, people who live under such conditions, got to be speech that is severely limited. Severely limited. So the point I'm making here, and there's so much more that could be said, this is just a skimpy little nod in this direction, but the point I'm making here in terms of wise speech is that there are hidden and not so hidden social constraints on many people that prevent them from using wise speech, who can't speak authentically. In fact, when wise speech, as we are talking about it right now, would be a luxury, in fact, potentially a fatal luxury. And another point that I think we can draw from all this is that for those of us who are committed to using wise speech, to recognize that, depending on the circumstances, wise speech may not be enough. That we, in addition, need to be aware of our unconscious assumptions, our own unconscious assumptions, before we can really communicate with others. And in particular, we, and I'm saying now, those of us who are white Americans, need to be conscious of our white privilege and how it affects our efforts when communicating with people of color. For all our sincerity, in such cases, wise speech may not be enough. And I'll say here that we at IMCC, Insight Meditation Community of Charlottesville, are focusing, there are some of us focusing and using and have white awareness groups. And if anybody is interested in that, you can contact Bev Wan, and she's coordinating this and is available to respond if you have questions or interest. She's available at bevwann@gmail.com. So, wise speech. More complicated, as the Buddha said, than one single factor. And so I'd like at the end to suggest that for each of us, we might consider if we are in any relationships that constrain us from speaking wisely, and explore how we might begin to use wise speech in those relationships. We might consider also if and where we give ourselves license to use unwise speech. For example, do we gossip? Maybe it's in our humor, just joking around and perhaps hurtful jokes, considering why we do it and what we derive from it. And also maybe an exercise. Try focusing on one aspect of wise speech for a day, like truthfulness or loving kindness in our speech, and sensitize ourselves to the little times when we slip, maybe through an exaggeration, just noticing and noticing. So these are comments on wise speech, and I thank you for listening.